Hello and welcome to the Purpose Pursuit podcast with me, Hannah Miller. It is a delight to be back with you today, and I am really looking forward to this episode. It comes about because so many people struggle, including me, including everyone in many ways, with decision making. How do we make a good decision? Do you think you make a good decision? Do you think you're good at making decisions? When was the last good decision you made? When was the last bad decision you made? What decisions are you currently facing that you aren't able to find a solution for or know what's the right thing to do? Because of the fact I spend a lot of time talking to people and because I'm a human myself, I know this is an important topic. And I decided to do some research into everything around decisions. And I read a brilliant book called How to Decide by Annie Duke. Annie Duke used to be a professional poker player. And I guess learning to make quick, rational, good decisions is quite important in that field. So you don't just go with your gut or go with bias of how you think something's going to turn out. And so she took the time to write a really excellent book on how to make good decisions. And as I'm recording this, I'm thinking about things that I'm mulling away, decisions I've got to make, the way I tend to make decisions, and other people that I care about who are in the middle of making decisions. My son, my middle son, has got, at the time of recording, he's got about 3 weeks to decide which university offer he's going to take. And the question is, how do you make that decision, you know? How do you decide which one is going to be the right one to take? We've got little decisions that we make every day, like what are we going to have for dinner? And then we've got the big decisions of who are we going to marry? Where are we going to live? What job are we going to take? Should I leave my job? Should I stay? Should I move locations? Should I buy a house? Should I invest that money in this? Should I watch this show on telly? There's a whole load of decisions we're making every single day. In fact, the data suggests that we make 33 to 35,000 decisions every day. Oh my goodness. Now, loads of those, 95% of those are subconscious decisions, like making the decision to pick up my pen. But there is still about 5,000 decisions a day, therefore, that we are making, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 that we're making every day consciously and having to think about. So no wonder it's important, and no wonder there can sometimes feel like clutter around decision making. And so what I'm going to do is take us through some of the principles that I got from Annie's book, so you can be listening and reflecting on the role this could play in your life. Do you do this already? Do you do this in a good way or in a way that's not so helpful for you? And I want to kind of expand what Annie talks about as well to include some of my own thinking around this and my own sort of from my own learning. So the word decide, it comes from the Latin decidere, and I might not be saying that correctly, but that means to cut off or to cut away. And so when we're making a decision, we are literally lopping off potential options, cutting away, cutting through, and deciding. I guess that's probably where deciduous comes from. I don't know, something, plants. I'm going into things I know nothing about. I don't know anything about plants. But when we're thinking about decisions, we often don't go through the most helpful processes. Sometimes we become so rational that everything is about the data that we have, and then we don't consider the human impact. Sometimes our decision making is so gut-led that we aren't being very rational about our decisions. Sometimes we are too quick to make decisions. Sometimes we are too slow to make decisions. Sometimes we make decisions based on previous outcomes and that guides us, or we take too much emphasis on what other people think we should do, or not enough emphasis on what other people think we should do. So there are a whole load of ways that our decision making can go wrong. And what happens is we end up feeling like the stakes of a decision, the high stakes of a decision, which can cause us to just end up not making a decision at all. I wonder what you do when the decision feels high. What the high stakes? What do you do? Do you tend to just put off the decision or ask somebody else to make it for you? How do you, as in your life, deal with those big decisions? A global study said that 70% of business leaders would prefer a robot to make their decisions. I don't think it's just business leaders that feel like that. I think there's a lot of time where we would quite happily just say, chat GPT or whatever, AI, tell me what I should do here. And there may be some actual use in subcontracting out some decisions, but there's some processes that we can go through that also add in our humanity and add in who we are as individuals. I think before I get into some of Annie's principles, I think I want to mention a couple of my own here that I think are really important when decision making. I think we need to consider our own personality. And I'm obviously going to say that because I always talk about personality. But when it comes to decision making, you will have a natural preference of how you do that. You might be somebody who likes to make decisions alone or spend a lot of time thinking about them. Or you might be more of a collaborative decision maker and you've got to talk it out. And I think you need to use the personality that you've been given to help you with your decision making. But at the same time, you have to know what the challenges of your method are going to be. So if you are somebody who likes to make decisions alone and to do a lot of talking and thinking, a lot of thinking, that's fine. But there is a challenge to that method, which is that you aren't getting a lot of input from other people. If you're like me and you like to talk it out and you like to get other people's perspectives and process with others, the challenge there can be that there's too much input from other people, which just means you can never get to a place of decision. And I've learned actually with a couple of things where I've given people the opportunity to give me feedback recently, that oftentimes you just end up with a split decision and it doesn't help your decision making. You're just aware that there's a lot of people now who aren't going to approve of what you've decided. And so there is a shadow side, there is a difficult part to the way we naturally decision make. But we need to know ourselves, we need to know what we need to help us make good decisions. And if you are somebody that likes to talk it out, then you need to talk it out. I think I would also say emotion does play a role. Annie's book is very much about moving away from emotion, and I understand why she's done that. She's talking about being more rational and being more considered, but I can't deny there have been times in my life when I've just known in my gut that something isn't right. And Annie would say that that is not helpful. You know, that's not data, that's not something that I should consider. But I haven't been fully convinced of that. I haven't been fully convinced by what I've read that tentative, that sort of gut feeling sometimes needs to be paid attention to, and that needs to come in line with also the data and the decision making process I'm going with. And until they align, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm not going to do that because it feels like I'm crossing like this internal part of me that isn't in line with that decision, even if it sounds like a rational decision. So I wouldn't say discount that completely, but I would say that it's not a full mode of making decisions. I think you also need to consider your own personal values when decision making. And again, that's another element I would want to bring in. When you are making a decision, small ones, bigger ones, knowing what your values are and what you are trying to get closer to, as in terms of your life, what is fulfillment in your life, that is really important to keep that in mind. Does this decision get me closer or further away from my sense of purpose, from my values? That's a very important fail-safe to put in place. I don't think they tend to work out very well if we've made a decision that rationally sounds good or might have a good outcome, but crosses that sense of personal values or boundaries that we have in place. And that's where knowing your ultimate purpose and the things that you want your life to look like is really, really important. So all of that to say, who you are, who you've been made to be, your personal values, your emotions, your gut are important, but there are some principles and processes we can add in that help us make better decisions. So as you're listening to this episode, perhaps have a think about something that's on your mind that you are in the land of decision over. I don't mean something like, what am I going to watch on the television tonight? By the way, on that note, let me just give you some data on this. We spend, according to the data, here we go, let me just tell you, I've got it here. We spend 150 minutes a week deciding what we're going to eat, 50 minutes a week deciding what we're going to watch on Netflix, and 90 to 150 minutes a week on what we are going to wear. That means that the average person spends 250 to 270 hours per year deciding what to eat, watch, and wear. That means some of you are spending longer than that, and that means some of us are spending less. Oh my goodness. I don't think I spend that long doing those things, but maybe I do. Maybe I am spending more time thinking about those things. When the boys were little, we used to have Saturday night movie nights. And I reckon we used to spend 60 minutes deciding what film we were going to watch every flipping week. And then a friend said to me, why don't you just do it on rotation and just pick a name out of a hat and say, it's your choice this week, you choose. And I was like, gosh, that's groundbreaking. We were trying to come to a place of consensus every week, and we would just be, in the end, somebody would have to say, right, we're watching this. And yeah, that was a really good way to remove some of that clutter from that decision making. I definitely don't spend 50 minutes a week deciding what I'm watching Netflix. I don't even have Netflix, so I definitely am not. Okay, so there are small decisions that we need to get quicker at, but there are lots of bigger things that are going on in our thinking. We may even be in a year-long decision-making process about something like, is it time for me to move house? Or is it time for me to get a new job or retrain? Those bigger things are there. Then there might be somewhere in between the two, which is, should I take on this new project at work? Should I go for this promotion? Etc., etc. There will be things in your mind that you're making decisions on. So as you're listening to some of these principles, keep that in mind. You might also want to keep in mind a good decision you recently made. When did you make a good decision? Something that you did recently that ended up being a good decision. You might also want to think about some decisions you've made and you thought, oh, that wasn't a good decision. I shouldn't have done that. I was thinking in preparation for this about when we did the work to this house and we renovated it, we had a really tiny budget. And so one of the things we did was I did the plans for the builders. We didn't have an architect because we were trying to save the money. And do you know, it kind of worked out okay. But probably if I was giving advice to somebody else now, I'd say, get your plans drawn up properly. Don't cut that corner. So that's a decision that maybe wasn't wise because it actually had all kinds of implications. By the way, I did quite a good job of it, I just want to say. Right, so some things that we can think about in decision making so that we make better decisions, so that they're more robust decisions using some of Annie Duke's learning. One of the first things I took from the book is this idea of resulting, which I think is really, really interesting. She talks about how sometimes we decide whether a decision was good or bad based on the result. Now, that sounds really obvious, like obviously, if something doesn't work out, that was a bad decision. And she actually pushes against that idea and says it might not be a bad decision. So she says there are four kinds of outcomes that we can have, four kinds of ways of looking at things. And she uses a matrix, which is the quality of the outcome and the quality of the decision. So let's say I am running late for work. Let's say I've got a meeting and I'm about to get in the car and I am looking at the time it's going to take me to get to work and I am going to be late for that meeting. But let's say I make the decision, okay, I'm going to be late for this meeting, but instead of breaking the kind of speed rules, I'm going to stick to the speed limits and I'm just going to hope for the best. So that you could say was a good decision because I wasn't breaking the law, but I end up being late for work anyway. That you could say is a bit of bad luck. Okay, never mind, it didn't work out. What about if I make a good decision and I decide to not break the rules and to stick with the speed limit, and I actually, by some miracle, just actually managed to make it to work on time, or something else happens, like the meeting starts late. You might say that's an earned reward, okay? I did the right thing, I made a good decision, and I got a good outcome. What about if I make a decision, which you might decide the decision quality was bad? I'm going to cut through a red light. I'm going to put my foot down. I'm going to try and cut some corners with the speed and with the traffic and with the traffic lights in order to get to work on time. And how about if I do that, and you might say that's a bad decision quality, but nobody catches me. I don't get a speeding fine. The police don't see me go through the traffic light, and I get to work on time. You could say that's what's called dumb luck. It was a bad decision with a good outcome. Does that make it a good decision? She would argue, no, it doesn't. What about if I make that bad decision and I run through the lights and I speed on my way to work and then I get caught and I have a speeding fine, or the police pull me over for running a red light? You'd call that a bad decision with a bad outcome. And that is your just desserts. So if you think about decisions in this four-way matrix rather than good decision, good outcome, there actually are four different things instead. You can have a good decision with a good outcome. That's your earned reward. But you can have a good decision with a bad outcome. That's bad luck, and that happens in life sometimes. We can make a bad decision and it works out well on that occasion, and that's called dumb luck. Or we can have a bad decision with a bad outcome, and that is your just desserts. And what she's trying to say here is that there is always an element with decision making, even good decision making, where there is some factors involved. You'd have to call it luck. You can call it just circumstance, that mean that your decision might not go how you'd hoped it would, or it may go how you didn't expect it would. And that is the element of those uncontrollable factors, a little bit of luck, or things just going your way. And I love this idea of thinking about your decisions this way, because what she's trying to say is that the result doesn't always tell you that the decision was a good one. You may have actually made a really good decision based on everything that you knew or what was the right thing to do, and you could have a bad outcome. That doesn't mean that your actual decision should have been different. So I want you to think about that as you even go through this, and as you're listening, where have you wrongly kind of put this pressure on yourself that, well, I don't make good decisions because this didn't work out how I thought it would. And actually that's confirming something that's just not true. It was the element of the uncontrollable things that happen in life that mean that sometimes a good decision does not work out for us. Even if on paper, with everything we knew, it suggested that it would work well. One of the things that she encourages people to do is to therefore review those decisions and review when something goes well, or also review when something doesn't go well. I'm just going to give you a couple of Annie's questions that you might want to listen to or come back to or even write down. She says, could you have got more or better information before deciding? Could you have decided more quickly? Could you have taken more time with the decision? Was there information you learned after the fact that you could have known beforehand that might have changed your decision? Were there even better outcomes possible than the outcome you got? And if yes, if you'd made a different decision, could you have increased the probability of those better outcomes occurring? And I really like those questions. Even if it's gone well, could it have gone even better? If you'd have made a different decision, would you have got a different outcome? And this one's really important. Was there information you learned after the fact that you could have known beforehand that might have changed your decision? Now, there are some things you just can't know without a crystal ball. But there are other things that she's talking about that actually, if you could have known that beforehand, and if you'd have done some research, information, and brought it into that decision-making process, you could have used that to guide the decision. But the point of asking that question is, some of the information that you have after a decision, you can't have until you've made it. And it reduces this feeling of, I've made a wrong decision because of the result that you got. And I think it's really, really good, both directions, not overplaying the role of luck or underplaying the role of luck in the decisions that we come out with. So that's all about resulting. There's another thing that Annie talks about, which is hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, which kind of relates to what I was just talking about. She says there's 3 kinds of bias that we can bring into our decisions or other people's. Let's say a friend of mine says that they're going to move to Alaska for a new job. And I hear them talk about this and I'm like, there's no way they should do this. They're going to hate it. They're nowhere near their family. It's freezing. Yes, they're going to have this amazing job, but they're going to really hate the way life looks. And that's my opinion. And let's say this friend goes to Alaska and they hate it. Then what my bias, my hindsight bias would have been, I knew this all along, or I told you so. Those are types of hindsight bias. Or you could have another type of hindsight bias, which is that I should have known this. With the things that I know of myself, I should have known it already. And so Annie talks about being careful with hindsight bias because, again, it's just confirming what we thought because the outcome then matched with what we thought. So what she says to consider first of all is, what is the hindsight bias that I'm thinking? Was it I should have known it? Was it an I told you so? Or was it I knew this would happen all along? And then to decide whether you really did have this knowledge, she asks you to go through some questions. Well, was there information that was revealed after the fact? Was that information reasonably knowable at the time? Was the conclusion about the predictability of the result based on the information that was unknowable at the time? And then you realise, and you can look at this and reassess how predictable the outcome was. I.e., am I just lucky that I got the outcome that I thought? Or was this a bit of hindsight bias, that actually there was information that revealed itself afterwards? Now, if I know about my friend that they hate the cold and that they are really, really family people and don't like being without their family, that is not hindsight bias. That is really important data. It doesn't mean it's not going to work out for them, but it means there are some things that make the probability of it working out a bit lower. But if I actually don't know that about this person and I'm projecting my own feelings about the cold and my own feelings about family onto them, and then they still don't like it, that doesn't mean that I was right. It means that my information ended up being relevant. So the reason I'm telling you this is to think about when you are looking back on things and saying, see, I should have known this. Well, should you have known it? And also when you're watching someone else make a decision, are you right that you knew this would happen? Or is it just that the predictability was higher because of certain factors and things that you knew? So watch out for hindsight bias, watch out for resulting. They're not ways to make decisions, and yet we do a lot of it. Okay, we do lots of that. One of the other things that Annie talks about doing when something hasn't gone right, or even in the preparation, is to list all the other possible ways that could have worked out. So how else could have that decision worked out for you? Let's say you're the one going to Alaska and you hate it. What are all the other ways that could have worked out for you? And looking at those other reasonable outcomes to stop us from becoming so binary about the way things work out. When we are evaluating decisions we've made, but especially ones that haven't worked well, and also when we're thinking about making new decisions, Annie basically has this 6 steps that she thinks that you should think about. And I'm just going to give you what those are. So the first thing she says to do is to review a reasonable set of possible outcomes. If I go for a job and I go for a promotion, the reasonable set of possible outcomes are: I don't get an interview, I get an interview but I don't get the job, I get an interview and I do get the job, I get an interview, I don't get the job but I'm offered something different, I get an interview, I don't want the job, I don't get an interview and decide I didn't want it anyway, I don't get an interview, but it makes me start to think about what I'm going to do next. There are so many more decisions than just get job, don't get job. And so she says, go through the list of all the possible outcomes that could come from that decision. Then she says, identify your preference for each of these outcomes. To what degree do you like or dislike them all? So going through all those things I've just said, which of these outcomes do you like and don't like, given your own personal values as well? Then you can think about the preferences and the payoff of what your of the upsides and the downsides of each of these possible outcomes. To try and what this does really is it sort of reduces some of the impact of the decision, and you realise it's not maybe that big a deal anyway, even if any of these outcomes happen. Step 3 is to estimate the likelihood of each outcome unfolding. What's the likelihood of me going for a promotion and not getting an interview? What's the likelihood of me going and not getting it? All of these kind of likelihoods are important to consider. Then have a look at the likelihood of all the outcomes you like and dislike. So if you are going to have a high likelihood of an outcome that you dislike, you then have to decide whether there is enough payoff of the possible good outcome as to whether you're going to go for it or not. In a lot of cases, you realise that there are so many possible outcomes and so many ways this could go that you realise that the decision in and of itself, which is a big part of Annie's book, isn't as binary as being right or wrong, but part of a feedback loop of learning and seeing what comes from it. So I like this idea of going through this and repeating for each of the different, the steps are that you then go back round and look at all those outcomes again. So I like that idea of stopping and being more rational. Now, one of the things that's interesting that I haven't mentioned so far is that Annie is really anti-pros and cons lists. She doesn't like them because she thinks that we just use our own bias as we're doing it. We often have an opinion that we already have or a decision we're leaning towards. And so when we do pros and cons, we're just reiterating what we already knew. We aren't gathering new information by going through that process, whereas actually looking at all the possible outcomes and how you feel about them in terms of preferences is a better way of doing it. She calls that preferences, payoffs, and probabilities. There's another really interesting thing around this idea of bias and pros and cons. The reason she says pros and cons are no good is because we are not good at being rational about pros and cons. So instead, she says, can you try and have an outside-in view? So when you are a bit further away from a decision, sometimes you can bring some perspective that isn't going to be affected by all the bias that we already feel. If I think it's time to move house and I already sort of am leaning towards that decision, if I start writing a pros and cons list, I'm likely to find more pros and cons because I'm already asking the question and thinking it's going there. But the outside view is actively trying to find out what other people know. It's not about their opinion, but it's about what would an outside-in view of this be. And these are 2 tactics she says you can try. She says, ask yourself if a co-worker or a friend or a family was having this problem, how would you view their problem? How might your perspective differ from theirs? And what advice would you give them? And what kinds of solutions would you offer? In coaching, I sometimes say to people, what do you think the wisest person you know would say to you right now? And it's that idea of an outside view. We are capable of doing that, and that's a little bit easier to do than just using a pros and cons, which is just regurgitating our own opinion. She also says you can ask yourself if there are any relevant base rates or information you could find out about what's true of people in your situation in general. So basically, that is like, what is the data? If you're considering investing in a certain company, let's say, you could find out what is the likelihood of this startup company succeeding. Or shall I start my own business? It's not irrelevant to realise that most small businesses fail in the first 5 years. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's a base rate to take into consideration. Because rather than just saying, I will succeed, actually the data suggests you are likely not to. So what base rates and what information, which gives you an outside-in view, is important for you to understand. And I really like that idea. And I've been quite challenged by that because I've often thought about pros and cons and weighing things up that way. And she's very much suggesting that that is not the way to approach big decisions. So a couple of other things to mention for you. One is when we get stuck in analysis paralysis and we're spending way too long thinking about something that's not important enough. She says, ask yourself the happiness test. If I was to ask you, let's say you were making a decision about where to go on holiday this year. It's quite a big decision, it's quite a big decision for most of us. Not if you have holidays every few weeks, but if you are having your annual holiday, it's quite a big decision. And if I said to you, I'm going to meet with you in a week's time after that holiday, and I ask you how happy you are, then do you see how much relevance that decision would have on that? What about if I asked you how happy you were a month after that decision or a year after the decision? And the idea is seeing how much the decision actually is going to impact your happiness. It's another way of deciding the weight of the decision. And even for a holiday, I would argue that even a month after a holiday, even if it hasn't gone well, your happiness test is probably not going to be affected by that holiday. Even though a holiday is a big, big deal. And so what this does is it makes it realise that some of the things we're trying to decide about that are way smaller than that are not even going to affect our happiness a week from now, let alone a year from now. And then there are other decisions where they are much bigger and there is going to have an impact on your happiness in a year's time. So I like that idea of gauging the decision making and how much analysis I should do based on the level of happiness I'm going to have. Annie talks about understanding that there are lots of decisions that have limited downside and starting to realise what those are. Shall I wear a blue jumper today or shall I wear a caramel coloured jumper today? She calls that a free roll decision. It's so low decision. It's so low because there's so limited downside. Just flip a coin. Learn to see those things as non-decisions. Eliminating some of these things and just think this is a free roll. Even a meal out at a restaurant is close to a free roll. And when you really can't decide, she says, try to get down to the things like, if these were the only options, would I be happy with it? And then just flip a coin between those. There's something else that I wanted to mention that I thought was really good in the book. 2 things. One was about the idea of decisions and then quitting. She's very pro being in, what does she call it? Quit-tuitiveness. She talks about having quit-tuitiveness, which is learning when it is a good idea to quit. She says that quitters often win and winners often quit. And this is about recognizing that something hasn't worked out how you thought it would and being free to quit. My husband's still reading a book at the moment that he's admitted he really doesn't like. And I keep saying, just quit the book. Quit the book. This is hours you aren't going to get back. This, for me, is a quit-tuitive moment to just say, just quit it. You don't like it, you don't enjoy it. You start learning the piano and you think it's going to be great, but you really don't like it. Quit it. Why do we feel that is a bad thing to do? There are some things we need to dig in at and learn to continue with. I totally think that. I don't think we should quit everything, but there are things when you realise this hasn't worked out, just quit it. In fact, I was with my hairdresser yesterday and she was telling me how she had left a previous workplace and gone to work elsewhere, and how situations have transpired that she's got the opportunity to go back to where she was. And what the conversation transpired was that based on the information she had at the time, she made the decision to go elsewhere, but she's realised that actually she'd be better off where she was. And so she's decided to go back to where she was before. And that is a decision-making process where she made a decision. The outcome wasn't as she thought it might be based on the information she had at the time. And now she's got more information, and rather than just sticking at something, she's had the humility to return, and now she's in an even better place than she was before. And I think that's a really good example of this isn't what I thought it was, and I need to think carefully about whether I want to stick with this. There's a reason why we should stick at things, and I definitely don't think we should be quitting everything. But I think it's also important for us to recognise when we need to quit. Sometimes we don't make decisions because we're waiting for certainty. And I think that's a really important central point I want to make here. When I'm working with people and they're looking at the next steps for their life, you cannot wait for certainty because you will never have it. We cannot see everything that's going to come down the line. We cannot see our futures. And whether you have faith or no faith, whether you're a control freak or a very easy go with the flow kind of person, we do not control everything that's coming down the line. And we cannot make decisions based on certainty. Even if everything suggests this is going to work out, it might not. And even if everything suggests it won't work out, it might. So certainty cannot be the way you make a decision. And the more choice you have, the more anxiety you've got. So actually narrowing your choices down is quite important to help us get past decision paralysis. Another thing I really thought was interesting is that Annie talks about close calls and how hard decisions are actually easy. And I was thinking about this in relation to my son Jude, who's struggling to make a decision about which uni to go for. Maybe it's a difficult decision because he's got a collection of great options. And really the decision is easy because this is a great option and this is a great option and this is a great option, which is actually what I think it is. I think it's a close call. I think it's this would be all right and this would be all right. Because based on all the learning and all the thinking, all that we know, the results are potentially likely to be similar. And if it doesn't work out well, it is likely to be one of those situations which is good decision, bad outcome, not because it wasn't a good decision. And I think that releases the pressure of this magical formula of everything, we know exactly what's the right thing to do. And I think the final thing I'd say is just be really careful when you're both giving your opinion to other people or you are receiving other people's opinions. And be really careful for how you ask for people's help. Sometimes we ask for help and we make it really clear what our thoughts are. We already say, we give enough away to suggest what our hope is in what that person will say. So do your very best to present your request for feedback in a neutral fashion so people don't just get the signal from you what conclusion you'd like them to make. And learn to be really careful as how you help people make other decisions so that you don't just bring in certainty or this is obviously the direction you should take. And that's a note to myself. I can sometimes think things are no-brainers. I sometimes think I can see decisions really clearly and that it's really obvious what someone should do. It's ABC, do this. And I have to reflect on the fact that, number one, there isn't only one right way. Number two, the outcome isn't the only part of a decision. And I might be wrong, probably am. There's lots of things that I might not know. So I think both giving and receiving of that kind of opinion from others, we just need to be careful how that we present that and also how we receive that from other people. So if you are in the land of decision, I hope some of this helps you with that. Annie Duke's book's excellent as well if you want to take a really deep dive. But hopefully this has given you some thoughts around this to help you get outside views, help you do decision trees, help you think about hindsight bias, help you think about the happiness test, and realize that maybe this hard decision is really an easy one because you're in a great situation. If you've enjoyed this episode, please let us know. Drop me a message, drop me an email, put a comment on YouTube, wherever you're listening. And if you've got someone in your life who is trying to make a decision, why don't you forward this episode to them and give them the chance to listen to it? And if you're enjoying the pod, please leave us a review because it really helps us. And if you are a regular listener, you're going to want to listen in because next week's episode has a bit of a big announcement. Have a good week. Bye.